Welcome back to the Deep Dive. You know, sometimes the most intense debates about culture and legacy don't happen in political arenas or corporate boardrooms.
Right.
They happen in the places we often go for escapism, the worlds of fantasy and gaming.
And that's exactly where we're headed today.
Today, we are undertaking a complex and highly charged deep dive right into the heart of a genuine culture war. It's playing out right now among authors, fans, and corporations in the realm of Dungeons & Dragons and, of course, J.R.R. Tolkien's legacy.
That's absolutely right. Our sources for this deep dive are, they're intensely focused on this philosophical split that's emerged in the fan community. We're working from a single, highly critical... Just one, but it's a detailed transcript of a video created by YouTuber John Del Arroz. And this source, it takes a very strong stand. It's an explicit counterattack aimed at another massive YouTube personality, Daniel Greene.
He has, what, over 500,000 subscribers?
He does. So we're essentially analyzing a high-profile fight between two giants in the fantasy commentaries. The source claims that Daniel Greene, we'll call him DG, launched an insane rant against two foundational pillars of modern fantasy.
J.R.R. Tolkien, so JRT, and D&D creator Gary Gygax.
Exactly, Gigi. And the whole controversy, according to our source, was originally kicked off by comments made by Elon Musk regarding D&D, quote, going woke.
Right, I remember that. So the central conflict here, it's multifaceted.
It really is. It's about creative legacy, it's about commercial viability, and it's fundamentally about value. So our objective today isn't to, adjudicate who is right or wrong.
No, of course not. We need to act as impartial guides.
Exactly. We need to thoroughly parse out the specific, often inflammatory claims and counter-arguments made in this source material. We're looking at legacy, value systems, and the current state of fantasy media, and we'll be detailing the rationale behind the source's highly critical stance.
Okay, let's unpack this. This is heavy material. It is crucial for us to understand the specific framework and the language the critic is using.
It is.
Because this source characterizes DG's actions not just as disagreement, but as a symptom of a larger cultural rot driven by what they call access media shills.
That's a necessary distinction to make right up front. We have to clearly define the source's perception of DG's perspective and then, fully explore the sweeping counterclaims the source offers about the reality of the fan.
Especially around the alleged commercial failures. Right out of the gate, in the very first section of the source material, the critic establishes a highly aggressive tone.
Oh, absolutely.
They allege that Daniel Greene just went full SJW shill against Gary Gygax and J.R.R. Tolkien, and they immediately link this behavior directly back to comments Elon Musk made months prior.
The comments about Dungeons & Dragons and its perceived woke direct modern.
Exactly. So the source is framing this entire incident as reactive behavior.
That's a good one. They're suggesting DG didn't just spontaneously create this video. No, he was responding to the massive public attention that Musk criticism generated.
So in the source's view, this highlights DG's role as a kind of defender of the mainstream narrative.
Precisely. And the source, well, they're uncompromising on the premise of the debate. They assert that D&D objectively went woke in the modern...
Objectively. That's a strong word.
Very. And they claim DG attempts to minimize that reality or, quote, pretend like it doesn't exist.
So that sets up the fundamental opposition. The source sees the woke shift as an undeniable fact, while DG, in their eyes, is just denying what's obvious.
And this takes us directly to the source's analysis motivation, which is just central to their entire argument.
Right, with over 575,000 YouTube subscribers.
The source argues that this success isn't organic. They say it's achieved because DG is shilling for the mainstream media and promoting the content they want to promote.
Okay, let's delve deeper into this concept, this access media shill. It's a specific term of cultural critique. How does the source claim this mechanism works? And, why is it so relevant to DG?
Well, the source views DG as someone who requires access and approval from corporate entities. Think Hasbro, major publishers, Hollywood studios.
To maintain his channel.
To maintain his subscriber numbers, to secure interview opportunities, get those early review copies, all of that.
So the source's claim is that DG must never criticize the hand that feeds him.
That's the argument. If D&D, which is owned by Hasbro and Wizards of the Coast, goes in a woke direction, a true access shill must defend that direction.
And attack its critics.
And attack its critics, even if it means attacking the game's founders.
So the source's theory is that DG's clout is directly tied to his perceived lack of integrity, that he's forced to act as an industry gatekeeper who suppresses dissenting viewpoints in favor of whatever the corporate sanctioned narrative is.
Precise. The critic characterizes this behavior as the unavoidable consequence of pursuing mainstream status in today's media environment. You do whatever is necessary, including ideological conformity, to maintain that massive visibility and access.
Now, this is where the source introduces a deeply personal And frankly, a pretty scathing critique.
It gets very personal, yes.
They note the irony. The DG feels the need to moralize about the greats like Gygax and Tolkien, despite DG himself having previously been embroiled in a scandal.
A scandal involving cheating on his wife, and they specifically mention another YouTuber, Naomi King, in that context.
So why? Why is the source bringing up personal history in an ideological debate about DG?
Well, the source uses this point to establish what they see as a moral double standard. They're arguing that DG is prioritizing political morality over integrity.
Okay, explain that.
The source claims that the SJWs, or woke proponents, often overlook or excuse failures in personal morality like cheating, but they place tremendous weight on political morality, whether older fantasy works are deemed sexist or racist.
So the argument is that DG can maintain his mainstream status despite personal failures because he successfully conforms to the dominant political morality by attacking Gygax, and that demonstrates the corrupted value system of the media sphere today.
Exactly. The source is saying, you can't claim the moral high ground to judge the founders of the fantasy genre when your own personal life is, in their view, compromised. Unless the only morality that matters to your contemporaries is your political alignment. So this deeply personal angle is used to reinforce their overall thesis that DG's critique of the fantasy founders is driven purely by the need to signal political purity, not actual morals.
Okay, let's shift back to the core complaint about the game itself. The source is adamant that the modern edition of D&D objectively went woke.
Adamant.
And DG is accused of attempting to minimize that reality and allegedly dismisses the audience upset about the changes, calling them a vocal minority.
This is a critical point of contention. It's about market perception versus what the source claims is market reality.
And the source strongly counterclaims that the segment of the audience upset about the changes is, in fact, the majority.
The majority. They contend that while many people stay silent, maybe they're fearful of online backlash or cancellation, they fundamentally don't like what's going on with the ideological changes being implemented in the game.
So the source frames the mainstream narrative that the critics are just a loud fringe group as a form of gaslighting.
That's the exact terminology at the source. They claim the corporation and its shills are attempting to manipulate the audience into believing their own dissatisfaction is illegitimate or, numerically.
So the source argues that the dissent isn't suppressed because it's fringe.
But because it's so widespread that acknowledging it would mean acknowledging a massive commercial mistake and the alienation of the core fan base.
Which means, for the source, the debate isn't just about disagreeing on rules. It's about fighting against a manipulative media narrative designed to protect a corporation's perceived ideological agenda.
And that sets the scene perfectly for the conflict over the actual legacy of the founder.
Moving into what are probably the most provocative claims, the source alleges that DG attacked J.R. Tolkien's fundamental belief and explicitly called Gary Gygax racist and sexist.
Right. And the source labels this consistent need to critique historical figures through a modern lens as the hallmark of SJW pop.
An incessant need to throw the past's great under the bus. That's the quote.
That's the quote. The source views this critique as an expression of, modern cultural arrogance. They claim that contemporary activists act as if modern values are inherently superior to those of the past.
Despite the fact that those older value systems demonstrably produced great works that still resonate today.
Well, the current system, according to the source, is producing things they just dismiss as a shallow skin.
Okay, let's address Gary Gygax first. The source confirms DG stated that initial printings of original D&D or Advanced Dungeons & Dragons AD&D had issues with sexism and racial influence.
He did!
So for the benefit of understanding the opposing viewpoint that DG is likely referencing, what specific elements of Gygax's early work might DG be criticized?
Well, based on known historical critiques, DG would likely be referring to things like the limitations placed on female characters in early...
Like strength caps.
Strength caps, inability to achieve the highest strength score, certain class restrictions, things like that. And regarding racial influences, he would likely be pointing to the often monolithic and inherently evil descriptions of certain monstrous humanoids.
Orcs, goblins.
Exactly, orcs or goblins whose characteristics were presented as, intrinsic to their biology rather than natural environment.
Yet the source just vehemently reject this critique of Gygax. They state emphatically, what the hell, shut up, by the way, AD&D is perfect.
Yes.
What specific integrity is the source implicitly defending when they declare AD&D perfect?
I think they're defending the integrity of the system itself and the internal coherence of Gygax's implied worldview. When they call it perfect, I think they mean it perfectly captures the spirit of heroic fantasy and the traditional concept of inherent good and evil that they believe is necessary for enduring story.
So any perceived sexism or racial influence is what? Just dismissed.
It's dismissed as either historically accurate to the fantasy tropes Gygax was drawing from, or as a minor imperfection not worth modern moralizing.
And the source connects DG's alleged attack to a specific previous flashpoint, the introduction of a D&D history.
Written by Jason Tandro, where Tandro allegedly called Gygax sexist, racist, the Gambit.
Why does the source find this incident so shocking?
Because Tandro is identified by the source as a lead designer at D&D at Hasbro. So this means the critique of Gygax wasn't just coming from some random fan.
It was being officially sanctioned.
It was being officially sanctioned and written into the history by the very people now running the franchise. So when DG repeats similar claim, the source sees him not as an independent critic, but as a loyal amplifier of the corporate critique against the founder.
Which is a key role for an Access Media shill.
The key role.
Okay, moving to Tolkien. DG allegedly claimed JRT had beliefs that don't stand the test of time, repeating this multiple times but never providing specific. Why does the source find this specific tactic of non-elaboration so objectionable?
They see it as intellectual cowardice. The source calls it a Weasley thing to do because it functions purely as virtue signaling to the SJW.
So DG gets the credit for signaling that he recognizes Tolkien as problematic, which appeases his politically correct contemporary.
Exactly, but he doesn't have to take the heat that would come from directly specifying an offense to the vast majority of Tolkien fans.
And what specific implied critique does the source speculate DG was referencing?
The source speculates DG is participating in the common contemporary interpretation that the, inherently evil nature of orcs in Lord of the Rings is racist because orcs are black people, or a stand-in for non...
But DG didn't explicitly say that.
No, he didn't. But the source assumes this interpretation is the cultural standard DG is tacitly bowing to.
Now we arrive at the source's strongest philosophical counterclaim. The source argues that the true beliefs of J.R.R. Tolkien, his devout traditional Catholicism, and the real Christianity within Lord of the Rings are precisely why his work does stand the test of time.
This is where the cultural critique really transitions into a theological.
Expand on the source's argument.
The source argues that Tolkien's work endures because it is grounded in a 2,000-year-old tradition that provides an objective, eternal framework for morality,
allowing for clear distinctions between good and evil.
Yes. They claim this framework provides the necessary weight and meaning to the struggle that makes the story so resonant across generations.
And this 2,000-year-old tradition is, according to the source, what DG's modern woke politics deem passé.
Exactly. The source mocks DG, calls him a moron for suggesting that Tolkien's values don't endure. They argue that the modern value system DG represents has only been dominant for like 10 years and has nearly collapsed our society.
So they conclude that the Lord of the Rings works precisely because JRT's traditional mores and values are timeless.
They do. It's a very potent image, the source. They even mention DG has a Lord of the Rings.
Right. So wearing the creation while simultaneously rejecting the creator's soul. How does the source leverage this specific personal detail to bolster its philosophical point?
It's used to highlight the depth of the hypocrisy of the sea. The tattoo represents an appreciation for the aesthetic.
But the critique represents a rejection of the foundational truth, the moral coherence that made the creation brilliant in the first place.
The source claims that DG is trying to surgically separate the beautiful art from the conservative or religious value created. And in the source's view, that separation is impossible.
Why?
Because the success of the work is directly tied to the creator's traditional world.
So the argument is that the current crisis in fantasy isn't a simple matter of taste. It's a symptom of a cultural clash where modern fleeting political values are attempting to cannibalize and redefine older objective moral framework, and that threatens the durability of the art itself.
That's the argument in a nutshell.
Let's pivot now from the philosophical debate over legacy to the corporate reality as presented by the source. The critic claims that the cultural changes enacted by D&D's owners have resulted in major commercial consequences.
Major. The source asserts that the 2024 edition of D&D, which is the period when they claim the corporation fully inserted all this crap.
All this crap meaning the ideological and cultural shifts.
Right. They claim that edition was a significant commercial failure. They make the staggering claim that this new edition was one of the worst-selling products in Hasbro history.
That is a massive claim to make about a flagship product like D&D. What elements specifically does the source believe contributed this catastrophic sales performance?
Well, the source doesn't list every single change, but we can infer they're reacting to the well-known moves made by Wizards of the Coast or WOTC in recent years.
Moves to de-emphasize traditional fantasy tropes that they deemed problematic.
Exactly. This includes things like changing the in-game descriptions of racial groups to make them less monolithic, removing negative biological determinants.
Like inherited evil traits for orcs or drow.
Yes, that's a big one. And a push toward a broader, more inclusive representation in artwork and narrative text. The source claims these changes alienated the existing traditional core audience who value the classic, sometimes harsh, fantasy archetypes Gygax established.
And the source alleges this poor sales performance was so severe that Hasbro was forced to dramatically cut back from the ambitious projections they'd established during the highly successful 5th edition era.
They do.
So how did this alleged commercial disaster trigger a shift in the corporate business model?
The source claims that because the core product failed to meet expectations, the company had to retreat from treating D&D purely as a core tabletop brand. Instead, they're pivoting to become what the source terms a lifestyle brand.
A lifestyle brand. That sounds like a euphemism for something else entirely. What does that entail in the source's view, and why is it a sign of failure?
To the source, this pivot means D&D is focused on selling tangential, high-margin, low-risk items and licensing opportunities rather than relying on the sales of core rulebooks.
Like what?
The source specifically mentions D&D selling things like crochet books and heavily licensing content to videos.
Crochet book?
Crochet book. This is interpreted as a failure of the core artistic direction. If the ideological changes alienated the tabletop player base, the only viable financial path is to monetize the name recognition of D&D through merchandising and ancillary products.
So they're effectively transforming the brand from a game system into a marketable aesthetic.
That's the argument.
Okay, if the corporation is changing its business model because the new core edition sold so poorly, then that seems to directly confirm the source's previous counter that the critics of woke D&D are the numerical majority, not the vocal minority DG allegedly claimed.
That is the exact conclusion the source draws, and it brings us right back to the gaslighting allegation.
Right.
The source argues that DG is complicit in gaslighting the fans by suggesting that fans are the ones making it an issue when they call out that's made by the corporation.
So the source argues that the corporation made the changes, the bastardization, and then blamed the fans for noticing and reacting negatively.
Exactly. The source uses strong evocative language. They argue that fans are simply reacting to the skin suit change.
Just skin suit change.
The replacement of the cherished original D&D identity with a hollow, ideologically driven version. They state that the pain fans feel when they see this bastardization of beloved work is legitimate.
And the source expands this argument beyond D&D, citing Amazon's The Rings of Power series as a parallel example. How does Rings of Power fit into this narrative of corporate corruption and fan gaslight?
The source views Rings of Power as another instance where a corporation, in this case Amazon, took a sacred cultural artifact, the Lord of the Rings, and injected it with modernisms and woke,
resulting in a work that, in the source's view, lacks the soul and integrity of the original creator.
Yes. The source argues that when fans notice the corruption in D&D or in Rings of Power, and they call it out, they are immediately accused of being bigots or a minority.
When in reality, they're just resisting the evil, soulless entity that is attempting to profit off the destruction of the original vision.
It is a profound resistance movement against the corporate ownership of cultural memory. The source is saying, you break it, and then you blame us for pointing out.
That is the core dynamic they are highlighting. It redefines the fan's role from consumer to cultural guardian, compelled to fight the very corporation that now owns the property.
A powerful idea.
The source suggests that Daniel Greene dedicated more time in his video to attacking Elon Musk than he did to focusing on Gygax or Tolkien,
which to them indicates the importance of this specific political confrontation.
Let's analyze the source's portrayal of the argument centered around Musk.
Okay, so the source frames this as the ultimate test of DG's shill status. The conflict began when Musk commented on social media, agreeing with a post that criticized modern D&D, particularly the official history's treatment of Gygax.
And the source asserts plainly that Musk is 100% right about Dungeons & Dragons and its ideological shift.
100%.
So how did DG, according to the source, allegedly respond to Musk's critique of the game?
The source claims DG immediately dismissed Musk, painting him as simply a snippy voice against woke Dungeons & Dragons.
So he didn't engage with the points?
No. Instead of engaging with Musk's actual points about the game's trajectory or the commercial issue, the source alleges that DG attacked Musk heavily on a personal level.
The source offers specific evidence of these attacks, claiming DG called Musk a loser and later a creep.
That's right.
What is the source's interpretation of this strategy, attacking the messenger instead of the message?
The source views it as definitive proof that DG cannot debate the factual points of D&D's commercial or ideological direction, because the facts, like the alleged commercial failure, support the critics.
So the only available tactic is character assassination.
That's what they claim. They say this is typical behavior for DG and others who operate within SJW echo chambers. They don't ever get outside their echo chambers, and they try to ban everybody differently.
So attacking Musk personally is seen as a way to delegitimize the argument without having to address its substance.
Yeah, and this leads to the source's accusation of doublethink against
Doublethink.
DG claims he loves D&D and Lord of the Rings and would never try to cancel the authors, yet he simultaneously attacks their core values.
The source sees this as intellectual inconsistency, or what they call being wishy-washy.
Right. DG wants to maintain his fantasy fan credentials, telling his audience he loves these classic properties. But at the same time, he has to appeal to his contemporary peers who do regularly try to cancel Gygax and Tolkien.
So by calling the authors bad for their beliefs, but saying their creations are still valid,
the source argues DG is attempting a contradictory balancing act that ultimately failed.
This inconsistency underpins the source's most powerful implication regarding DG's motives and the state of modern publishing.
It's a huge
The source claims that if Gary Gygax and J.R.R. Tolkien were alive and producing their works today, Daniel Greene would cancel them and never give them positive coverage.
It's a bold assertion about ideological, and the source claims the reason is purely
because they'd be perceived as
Christian, largely right-wing in their viewpoints by the modern media. The source contends that in modern culture, anyone who holds traditional, especially Christian views, is essentially to the right of Chairman Mao and is subsequently blacklisted from major publishing or media.
So the source is positing that the real double standard is in the modern media landscape itself. They claim it's systematically hostile to traditional or Christian viewpoints, even if those viewpoints produce the very foundation of the fantasy genre DG professes to love.
Absolutely. DG is accused of engaging in the real doublethink by claiming to adore the creations while simultaneously trying to erase the foundational value soul that underpins.
So in the source's view, DG is acting as an ideological peer,
ensuring that only creators who conform to modern values can receive main praise, even if it means criticizing the historical figure. Find the entire.
This philosophical conflict takes center stage in the next section, where the source attempts to explain why, in their view, modern culture and contemporary fantasy creators are failing to produce works of enduring quality.
Right. And the source argues that modern culture, when you compare it to the older moral systems that produce Gygax and Tolkien's works, is nothing more than a skin suit.
A superficial imitation.
A superficial image. The fundamental diagnosis is that social justice activists and the modern creative class lack objective morality, and they fail to recognize that perhaps their values are the problem.
They are claiming that the collapse of a clear, objective moral framework directly correlates with the collapse of literary quality and endurance.
That is the core thesis. The source asserts that many modern creators, Hollywood, comics, fantasy, they lack a real value. And without that anchor of objective morality, a transcendent truth that defines good and evil beyond mere subjective.
The ability to tell a compelling, lasting narrative is fundamentally compromised.
It is.
And without objective morality, what is the specific consequence for the storytelling, particularly in fantasy, where the stakes are often caused?
The source claims it becomes impossible for modern creators to tell a story where good fights against evil that stands the test of time. If good and evil are just subjective cultural constructs that change every few years, there are no real stakes.
No genuine heroic victory.
No genuine heroic victory, and no message that resonates universally, unlike works grounded in traditional objective moral truth. The stories end up being about moral relativity, which the source argues is just inherently less compelling than moral certainty.
This framework leads to some specific and very sharp critiques of major contemporary fantasy authors. Let's start with George R.R. Martin and Game of Thrones.
Martin is criticized because, in the source's view, his works, specifically A Song of Ice and Fire, are structured around a kind of moral nihilism, because the world is amoral and unpredictable.
The source claims there is no win and no point to Game of Thrones.
That's the argument. And that lack of transcendent meaning is why, the source argues, Martin struggles to finish the series. There's no clear philosophical destination.
So they dismiss the property as, frankly, the most overrated property of all time.
They do. They suggest its darkness and complexity are often mistaken for depth, when it's simply a reflection of its moral vacuum.
And what about Brandon Sanderson? He's often praised for his meticulous world building and his prolific output. The source predicts nothing Sanderson does will stand the test of time.
A huge claim.
It is. Given his commercial success, how does the source justify this sweeping dismissal?
The source's critique of Sanderson's isn't primarily about the quality of his prose or his pacing. It's about thematic content and the value system.
So they're saying he's technically skilled, but
his works rely too heavily on modernisms and lack the necessary objective traditional moral gravitas that defined Tolkien. For the source, popularity now does not equal endurance later. Without that foundational objective morality, the stories will simply become dated and irrelevant as modern cultural.
This ties into the source's final claim in this section about the structural laws of modern fantasy, the reliance on modernisms in a medieval setting. What are these modernisms, and why does the source claim they corrupt the fantasy genre?
The modernisms are the injection of contemporary political, social, or psychological values, typically progressive values, into a setting that is aesthetically and culturally rooted in traditional, often European, medieval art.
And the source argues this creates a massive dissonance. Modern moral relativity cannot peacefully coexist with the structured, often religious or feudal, setting of medieval fantasy.
Yes, so if a story has a medieval setting but is driven by postmodern morality, the source claims it doesn't jive with that setting.
And the result?
The result, in the source's view, is corruption and destruction, rather than Tolkien and Gygax succeeded because their values were consistent with the archetypes and settings they were portraying, leading to a coherent, enduring. Modern creators, however, are just injecting anachronistic ideas, which the source believes inevitably bastardize itself.
After thoroughly diagnosing the perceived failures of the mainstream, the source creator, John Del Arroz, explicitly presents his own work as the necessary alternative.
He does. The video frames the creator's mission in very political and cultural terms, bringing back the culture and a clear mandate to making fantasy great.
So he's positioning himself as providing the only viable alternative to this mainstream nonsense produced by the access media shills and the corporate entities.
That's the frame. The source details the development of his 6-book series, Rolandia, which includes the title For Steam and Country. And this was reportedly developed as a direct reaction to the perceived decay of the steampunk genre.
What was his specific critique of steampunk?
The source found that when steampunk was at its commercial peak, the genre had become a precursor to romanticy.
Oh, romanticy.
Yeah, it shifted its focus away from engineering, action, and mechanics. The specific critique was that every steampunk book was that, meaning plots focused narrowly on romance tropes.
He gives an example.
He does. A girl with an airship and she's in love with a werewolf or something like that. The source saw this as a corruption, replacing the genre's action-adventure core with a sentimental focus.
So Rolandia was designed to reclaim the structural integrity the source found missing in the mainstream.
Yeah. The alternative focus of Rolandia for Steam and Country was written explicitly with action-adventure in mind. The source aimed to bring the genre back to what you'd see like in Dungeons and Dragons.
So focusing on mechanics, world structure, heroic action driven by clear stakes.
In direct contrast to the romance-driven plots they saw dominating the market.
This serves as the ultimate demonstration of the source's philosophy then. Instead of just complaining about the corruption, create an alternative product grounded in the traditional values they champion.
Absolutely. The final segment is a direct call to action. It encourages listeners to financially support real fantasy by checking out his work. It's available in ebook, print, and audio.
And crucially, by joining the community.
And by joining the community, which includes a newsletter and a Discord. The entire purpose of this community, the source stresses, is the political and cultural act of attempting to bring the culture back.
So in this view, buying this specific alternative work is not just a consumer choice. It's a political statement against Daniel Greene, Hasbro, Amazon, and the entire perceived culture of modern wokeness that they believe is actively destroying the fantasy genre.
It connects all the dots perfect. The ideological battle against the mainstream must be fought on the commercial battlefield by supporting creators whose foundational values align with those of Gygax and Tolkien.
This deep dive has shown us that the debate raging in the fantasy community is, well, it's far from trivial. What began as a criticism of a YouTube video quickly escalated into a comprehensive philosophical and cultural indictment. The disagreement isn't merely about fictional rules or D&D marketing. It is, at its core, a fundamental clash over whose value system will define the legacy of the past and the creative output of the future in the fantasy genre.
The traditional objective morality championed by the source, or the modern political morality they claim, is represented by Dan.
We've thoroughly parsed how the source is the main represented by DG, not just as a competitor, but as destroyer who corrupt established cultural artifacts using modern political value.
Conversely, the source views Gygax and Tolkien as brilliant creators, whose work endures specifically because it is grounded in timeless, objective value. And that makes their cultural artifacts inseparable from their creators' traditional morals.
The source has provided us with a clear framework for understanding one side of this highly polarized cultural war. Personal scandal is linked to political hypocrisy, commercial failure is blamed on ideological conformity, and the quality of art is directly tied to the moral clarity of the artist.
And this extensive analysis leaves us with one final provocative thought that builds on the source core. If a classic work's foundational success is indeed tied to the immutable traditional values and religious beliefs of its creator beliefs that provide the story with a clear, objective moral center, is it possible or even desirable for fans and critics today to fully enjoy and appreciate the brilliant creation while simultaneously trying to cancel the creator's soul because those values clash sharply with contemporary cultural norms?
That is the question of creative legacy that this conflict ultimately asks you to consider.